Alrighty, now that we've completed the retopology in the last lesson, which was lesson 6, we are now ready to UV each part of this weapon. Now, for this class, I will be demonstrating how to UV this weapon in Maya by utilizing the planar mapping tool, but I did definitely want to at least mention another great tool for creating UV maps, which is Hedis UV Layout. I definitely alternate between Maya and Hedis UV Layout to create all my UV maps. And I personally find Maya to be a good choice for UVing any sort of hard surface meshes, whereas I believe Hedis is a really good choice for UVing any sort of organic mesh. So if your weapon has some irregular or organic elements to it, I would definitely suggest utilizing Hedis UV Layout. However, for hard surface UVs, I personally find Maya to be a good default program to create my UVs in. To start us off, I'll go ahead and show you how to UV this major top stone piece right here. But also, first things first, we do need to cut this model in half, because again, we only need to UV one side of the model, because the other half will be completely identical. So I can combine the entire mesh, like so, go to face, delete out unnecessary faces, like so, separate it out again. So after I have deleted one side of the model and then separated the mesh out again, what I'm going to do next is select the object for this top stone piece, and then go to Create UVs, Planar Mapping Options, and now for this, because we know that we want to have Z-axis symmetry for this model, we also know that we will need a Z-axis planar projection. For the other settings in here, if I go ahead and do reset settings, you want to click the Z-axis, but besides that, we also do want to click on Keep Image Width Height Ratio. So I'm going to go ahead and click that on as well. So click that on from the default settings. With all of that chosen, we can now go ahead and click Project. And then now we can go to Window, UV Texture Editor to pull up what we just did. And I hardly ever, the first thing you'll notice is that there's this bounding box that was created for this planar projection. I hardly ever have to fool around with the bounding box at all. So I just hit Q on the keyboard to exit out of the bounding box, or the planar projection tool, and then start to really just evaluate the UV shell that has just been created. And one of the first things I also usually do is I do a general scale, or a general sort of rescale to an approximate size, which sort of represents how much real estate I believe that this shell should have here within this UV map square. This definitely corresponds to how important or how large the actual mesh is in comparison to the entire asset, or in comparison to all the other meshes that will exist within this entire UV map square. I mentioned that because for some very large or important assets, it might actually be necessary to have more than one UV map, and thus more than one set of texture maps for just that one asset. So after I've done the appropriate rescaling to maybe about, let me see, a little bit less, maybe something like that. So after I've done the appropriate rescaling, I also need to just kind of generally evaluate this UV shell right now to determine if there is enough UV spacing between all the different UV points, and to determine if anything's been sort of overlapped. So I can go in here, I can see that these points right here, maybe I can move this up a little bit, like so, to get a little more space. Then the other thing is that you might not notice at first, but we do have one point being overlapped completely. And that is because this bottom part right here has been capped or triangulated. So if I click on this right here, or if I also go to UV, and then select on that, I then go into the UV Texture Editor window and then pull this down like so. Just kind of pull it down a little bit. So that's kind of the main thing here on this piece, is it was that one hidden piece. And now, for some pieces or instances, it might make more sense to separate out some sort of bottom pieces or some other sort of pieces of a mesh into its own UV shell. But in general, I usually prefer to keep elements such as this merged with the original mesh, because it tends to give me better results within the baking phase. But if you find that the capped side, the bottom side, or just another aspect of the mesh is still also fairly dense with the amount of UVs, and is still somewhat visible to the viewer from other angles, it might work better to just separate that element out into its own UV shell so that it can receive a fresh or more accurate planar projection. Alright, so now I'll move this UV off, or this UV shell off to the side, because we're kind of done with this one for now. So I'll kind of move this up, and then I'll go ahead and this piece right here, I'll go ahead and do a planar projection. So we're going to go ahead and do the same exact steps that we did before. We don't need to hit options this time because it's the same exact settings. So I go ahead and just press on that, and then I can go ahead and hit Q, UV. Go ahead and scale this down. Oh, maybe about there. Kind of move this off to the side. And now there is actually one other thing I just noticed about these two shells I just created. You know, in sort of correlation to the concept or what we're seeing in the model, you'll notice that this is kind of flipped. So what we can do is actually very, very easy to fix this. You know, if you want this to kind of match the actual what you're seeing in the model, you know, it could maybe help if in Photoshop or something like that, if you have to do a painting in Photoshop. What we do is you select the entire shell, and then click this right here. And it'll flip it over so it matches the model or even just the concept that we had before. So I'm going to do the same thing down here. I'm going to select all of this because you'll notice that that is flipped. I'm going to click on that right there. Alrighty, so that is good for that. Now again, there is this one sort of piece right here for that capped edge. I'm going to move this up. And now the spacing right here, that's not quite, I don't think that's quite accurate. Like if I look at this from this view, you know, there's definitely more space than what this planar projection is sort of representing. So there's a couple things we could do. We could do what I kind of showed you earlier, which is that you know, the very manual sort of process where I can go ahead and select each one of these points and kind of, you know, move it out. Or another cool thing I can do is I can select each one of these individual points that I know I'm going to want to move, and then go to one of the new tools within Maya, which is go to polygons and then hit optimize. And that gives a pretty good sort of, well, that kind of moves it in a good sort of nice uniform way. So that's definitely a good, at least, you know, starting point for that kind of thing. So again, so this piece is now completed as well. Again, I can go ahead and just, you know, might as well do both these pieces as well. So go ahead and create UV's planar mapping, hit R, Q, R, scale this guy in like about so, move this up. I'm noticing down here, this piece, I think this is being overlapped completely. Yeah, actually, see here, this piece is getting completely moving up. So I'm gonna have to move this down and kind of just finesse this out a little bit. And then looks like there's a couple other pieces that are completely being kind of lost. So I'm gonna move this up like so. And then, yep, there's a capped bottom piece as well. Alrighty, so that is good for that. I can kind of go ahead and compare this to the size of some of these other things. I am now realizing that I have to move this guy over just a little bit, because when I'm done, I'm going to want to have all these off to the side so I can evaluate the shapes again. But that should be good. And now, in the interest of time, I will load up a version with all the UV shells created off to the side, because at this point, you should have a general idea of how to do this. You know, you use create UV's planar mapping, and that's how you kind of do planar mapping for all these cylinder pieces, all these different pieces right here. If you need to provide more spacing for any sort of part that's maybe getting cut off awkwardly, I would either manually do that or use polygons optimize, and then just make sure that any pieces that are being capped or being triangulated like this, make sure that you bring it down. You know, you need to make your own decision whether or not some of these pieces, if they're still heavily triangulated and they are still somewhat visible at other angles, maybe you need to separate that out as its own UV shell. But in this case, for my weapon at least, there is not an instance where I need to do that. So I kept all of those intact. Alrighty, so I'm going to load up that version right now, where they are off to the side, UV shells off to the side. Alrighty, so now this is what it looks like when it was all UV'd, but they're all off to the side. And now for this, I would definitely recommend not using just the default layout, because I'll show you what happens when I do that. It's not usually that efficient. So I've selected all of them. I hit layout, and you can see, the spacing between some of these UV shells is really not ideal, and there's quite a lot of kind of wasted space over here. So I'm going to undo that. But as bad as that kind of is, sometimes actually doing that, it could potentially give you some ideas on maybe how you can move things around. So sometimes I kind of I hit it anyways, just so I can get an idea of where I can move things. But yeah, so I'm going to kind of start off with the main important elements, which I know are going to be these stone pieces. And now the other thing, for this in general, I was always told that laying out your UV shells is kind of like playing Tetris or putting together a puzzle. So if you're good at Tetris as puzzle making, you'll kind of have a leg up here. But because basically you kind of want to mix and match these shapes in such a manner that you utilize the spaces most effectively. So you kind of want the shapes to lock together, also in such a manner that there isn't really all that much wasted space between the various UV shells. This can kind of be a little bit of trial and error, but with more experience, you will definitely be able to visualize a way for these shapes to be mapped out in a fairly efficient manner. A couple other pointers: it won't matter too much if you rotate any of these shapes quite a bit, because nowadays there's within like Photoshop there's the rotate canvas function. So if you rotate something quite a bit differently, like if I take this entire shell, if I hit Control to shell, and I rotate this quite a bit, that's not going to really matter, because then in Photoshop I can rotate the canvas if I need to still sort of paint it in more of a perpendicular fashion, or if it's an awkward angle for me to kind of draw or paint on top of, I can just rotate the canvas. Or the other thing, especially for this lesson, if you're using a 3D painting program such as 3D Coat, the orientation of your UV shells won't really matter, because you're painting on top of the model itself, regardless of UV shell orientation. In addition to that pointer, I would also still provide enough spacing between each UV shell, so that when you bake out the normal maps or the occlusion maps, that they don't sort of that one of the maps doesn't bake on top of it itself, like or below another one kind of thing. So you want to provide enough space between the UV shells, and then you also want to provide enough shape between the perimeter of the UV square and the actual UV shell itself. Alrighty, so I'll kind of start this off and move some of these around a little bit. I know this is the most important shape, so I'm almost going to want this, not necessarily the middle, but okay, I don't think I can make it maybe that big. Maybe scale it down a little bit more. It's about there. And I'm trying to think, okay, so this is a triangle shape. What can I fit over here in a space like this? Now, I don't have any of these shapes that are half a triangle, but what I can do potentially is sort of alternate some of these shapes. So it's a triangle up, triangle down, triangle up, triangle down. But then maybe right here, because this is the largest, the bottom stone, the other more significant piece, I can have these interlocked like so. Make sure there is still somewhat enough space between these. And then I'm going to select both of these. Move these over a little bit. Oh, make sure I have all the points selected. Make sure there's enough space on the top and the sides, like so. Move these around. And now I can basically just kind of take this piece, move this guy down, take this piece, move it up like that. This piece, move this down, like so. And I'm doing this a little quickly, I would really kind of go in and finesse this if I was doing this for real. I'm going to see here. I'm going to want this to be, kind of big because there's some good details in there. So I could do this, or it looks like it'll be more optimal if I rotate this over and bring this down, like so. So I'm kind of thinking I'm going to want this piece right here. Oh, just kind of move right there. And now I've got basically plenty of space for these other pieces. Alrighty, so again, in the interest of time, I'm going to load up the final version right now. So open scene, use final. Alright, so that's what I did for the final right there. And now, this could potentially, there could still be ways for this to be more optimized, but in general, I decided that kind of like the top half of the mesh is going to be a lot of the stone pieces. I try to give as much space as possible for areas that we're going to need a lot of sort of texture map work. This is sort of the glyph piece right here. So I want a decent amount of size for that. I want a decent amount of size for the handle wrap because there's some, detailed, even secondary forms within that. And then I just want these stone pieces, at least these two, to be fairly large. But I feel like this is a pretty decent sort of optimization of this space. I think I've given enough space between the UV shells, and again, this is also kind of a little bit of trial and error for the spacing between the shells. I'll find out when I'm in something like X normal, when I'm baking these maps out, whether or not I move this to the left or the right like enough. So after I do kind of a test bake, if I need to move these around a little bit more, I can kind of move it around really easily after sort of seeing how the normal map or the occlusion map is being baked out. But yeah, you now have a general idea of how I UV an asset. It's really pretty simple. You use create UVs, planar mapping. Again, if you're using something more of an organic shape or very irregular sort of meshes, I would also recommend using headless UV layout. But Maya's default creating UVs also works. Also, feel free to check out cylindrical mapping. Create UVs based on camera is also pretty sweet. It's based off how you're basically looking at the mesh from your viewport. From your viewport. That will determine how you lay out the UVs. So that's also kind of interesting. That can be nice. But for hard surface stuff, I find that create UVs planar mapping is really, really solid. Alright, so we're basically all set for the baking stage now. So we can go ahead and end this lesson. And then in the next lesson, which will be lesson 8, we will go over baking techniques, strategies, troubleshooting, mesh triangulation, etc. All that kind of stuff within both Maya, XNormal, etc. Alright, stay tuned for the next lesson.